He thought the cruelest thing he could do was make sure the whole city watched her walk in alone. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom at the Crescent Grand Hotel was glowing like a jeweled stage, all crystal chandeliers, polished marble, and the low hum of old money pretending not to stare. Ethan Crawford stood beneath the gold-lit arches with one hand in his pocket and the other wrapped around a glass he had barely touched, every inch the untouchable CO the business magazines loved to photograph. At 36, he had built Crawford Holdings into the kind of empire people spoke about with lowered voices and careful admiration, and tonight was supposed to be another polished victory. Investors were here. Board members were here. Half the city's social elite had come dressed in black tie and diamonds to witness the next chapter of his carefully designed life. And somewhere in the middle of all that elegance, tucked between the orchestra and the champagne towers, was the private satisfaction he had not admitted even to himself. Naomi Brooks had accepted the invitation. After all these years, after vanishing from his life without explanation, after leaving him with questions he had buried beneath deals, headlines, and a reputation for emotional discipline, she was coming. He had told himself it was harmless, just a name added to the guest list for old time's sake, but the truth felt colder than that. He wanted her to see what he had become. He wanted her to stand in the room and understand she no longer belonged in it. He wanted, perhaps most of all, to prove that the woman who had once shaken his world was now nothing more than a shadow outside the glass walls of his success. Near the front of the room, his fiancée, Vanessa Hale, laughed too brightly at something a senator's wife had said, one manicured hand resting on Ethan's arm as though she had already been engraved into the family silver. She was beautiful, poised, and perfectly acceptable in the way everyone expected, the kind of woman who fit a headline without disturbing it. "You're distracted," she murmured, smiling for the people around them while speaking only to him. Ethan barely heard her. His eyes had drifted again to the entrance. The master of ceremonies stepped toward the microphone. Conversations softened. Glasses paused in midair, somewhere behind the tall bronze doors. A movement caught the attention of the staff, and the room's polished confidence seemed to tilt by a single degree. Ethan felt it before he understood it, a strange stillness moving through the crowd like a whisper too heavy to stay quiet. Then the doors opened. Naomi Brooks stepped inside wearing a midnight blue gown that made the light seem to follow her instead of touch her, her shoulders straight, her expression calm, her presence so self-possessed it robbed the room of sound. But it was not Naomi alone who turned the gala into something else entirely. One small hand rested in hers, another in the opposite one. A little boy and a little girl, no older than 6, walked beside her in formal black and ivory, their faces lifted with quiet composure, their features delicate and unmistakable beneath the chandeliers. Ethan's breath stopped, because the children had his eyes. And in that single devastating second, the man who had invited his past to be humiliated realized his past had not come back to beg for dignity. It had arrived carrying the truth. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chandeliers above them. It did not crash through the room all at once. It spread slowly, table by table, glance by glance, until even the orchestra seemed to forget the next note. Naomi did not rush to explain herself, and that was what unsettled Ethan most. She stood at the entrance with one hand resting lightly on each child's shoulder, as if she had crossed 100 harder rooms than this one and had long ago learned that dignity did not need permission. The little girl wore a cream dress with a navy ribbon at the waist, her curls pinned neatly back with a pearl clip. The little boy stood beside her in a dark jacket and polished shoes, his expression calm in that old-fashioned way some children have when they are taught early to observe before they speak. Neither of them looked frightened. They looked prepared. Ethan felt his pulse move hard against his collar as the room sharpened and blurred at the same time. He knew those eyes. He knew the angle of that little boy's jaw, knew the shape of the girl's brows with a recognition so immediate it felt almost offensive. For one disorienting second, his mind rejected what his face had already betrayed. Vanessa's fingers tightened around his arm. "Who are those children?" she asked under her breath, though the answer was already beginning to form in every staring face around them. Naomi finally moved, not with hesitation, but with deliberate grace, guiding the twins forward across the polished floor while the crowd parted for her without being asked. Ethan remembered another night, years ago, when she had walked into a room full of strangers and still carried herself like she belonged to no one but herself. Back then, he had found it magnetic. Tonight, it felt like judgment. He watched her come closer, his chest filled with something colder than anger and sharper than confusion. She had not changed in the careless ways he once imagined she would. Time had refined her. Whatever softness had once made her easy to underestimate had been replaced by a steadiness that did not bend beneath curious eyes. She stopped a few feet in front of him, close enough for him to see the faint shimmer in the fabric of her gown, close enough for him to realize that even now she was not looking at him the way a wounded woman looks at the man who left scars behind. She was looking at him like someone who had already survived him. "Naomi," he said, and even to himself, his voice sounded unfamiliar. One of the children looked up at her. "Mom," the little girl asked softly, "is this him?" The question landed with the clean precision of a blade made of truth, and several people nearby inhaled so sharply it almost sounded rehearsed. Naomi lowered her gaze to her daughter and smoothed a hand over her shoulder before lifting her eyes back to Ethan. "Yes," she said, her tone even, measured, impossible to misread. "This is Ethan Crawford, not your father. Not the man who abandoned us. Not the ghost of a broken life. Just his name, offered plainly in front of the very society he had once trusted to define worth." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was a man known for answers, for command, for control under pressure, but in that moment all he could feel was the terrible collapse of an old certainty. Around them, whispers had begun to travel like sparks through dry air. A board member's wife leaned closer to her husband. A photographer in the back discreetly lowered his camera, sensing that what was unfolding had already become more dangerous than gossip. Vanessa stepped forward, her smile strained to the edge of breaking. "I think there must be some misunderstanding," she said, too brightly, too quickly. Naomi turned to her with the same calm she had carried from the door. "No," she replied. "The misunderstanding happened years ago." And for the first time that night, Ethan understood with full, sickening clarity that Naomi had not come to disrupt his celebration. She had come because this was the room he chose, the stage he built, and now, before the city that admired him, he was about to learn what it cost to be wrong about the woman who once trusted him most. For a long moment, nobody moved. The chandeliers still burned above them with the same indifferent elegance. The waiters still stood near silver trays of untouched champagne, and the orchestra remained frozen in a silence that had become more revealing than music. Ethan could feel every pair of eyes in the ballroom shift between him and Naomi, but the pressure of the room was nothing compared to the pressure building inside his chest. He had built his life around precision. Deals were measured. Risks were calculated. Reputations were managed before they could crack. Yet nothing in all his careful planning had prepared him for the sight of two children standing only a few feet away from him, wearing his features as innocently as if truth had been waiting all these years for the perfect room to reveal itself. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence, and that made the moment even sharper. She had always understood something Ethan had spent most of his life trying to master and never fully did. Real power did not need to raise its voice. It only needed to remain still while everyone else unraveled around it. Vanessa recovered first, at least on the surface. She stepped closer to Ethan, her hand now looped possessively through his arm, as though proximity could restore the order that had slipped from her grasp. "This is inappropriate," she said, turning to Naomi with the polished chill of a woman accustomed to winning rooms with polished charm and inherited confidence. "If you came here to make a scene, I think you should remember where you are." Naomi looked at her, then at the crowd. Beyond her, and the faintest trace of sadness passed through her eyes, not for herself, but for how predictable cruelty always sounded when dressed as etiquette. "I remember exactly where I am," she said. "That is why I came." Ethan swallowed. The twins remained close to Naomi, composed in a way that only deepened the discomfort of the room. The little boy glanced up at Ethan again, curious but guarded, while his sister held her chin with the same quiet steadiness Naomi carried like armor. Ethan found himself staring at them with an ache he could not name. Their ages, their faces, the timing. Pieces that should have been impossible were sliding together with a terrible and unmistakable logic. And with that recognition came something even harder to bear than shock. Memory. Naomi 6 years earlier, standing in his penthouse apartment with tears she had tried not to let fall. Naomi asking him, in a voice already breaking, to listen before he judged. Naomi leaving after one final conversation that had ended not with understanding, but with pride, suspicion, and a wound he had convinced himself she had caused. He had replayed that ending in his mind for years, always placing himself in the role of the man betrayed, the man forced to harden, the man justified in moving on. But now that version of the past was beginning to collapse under the weight of two small, breathing contradictions standing in front of him. "How old are they?" he asked before he could stop himself. Naomi held his gaze. 6, she said. Just one word, but it landed like an accusation written in numbers. Vanessa's posture changed. She turned fully toward Ethan now, her smile gone, her eyes searching his face for the first sign that this was no misunderstanding at all. Around them, whispers thickened. A trustee from Ethan's board took a slow step back. A woman near the front pressed her lips together, suddenly fascinated by the contents of her champagne glass. "Offer it yet? You invited me here because you thought I would walk in alone," she said quietly. "You thought I would be the easiest person in this room to make small." Ethan said nothing. He could not. Because she was right, and the truth of that was uglier than anything the crowd might assume. Naomi's voice remained even, but something deeper moved beneath it now, not bitterness, not rage, but the disciplined weight of a woman who had learned to carry pain without letting it deform her. "You never asked what happened after I left," she said. "You never asked why I disappeared. You only accepted the version that made it easiest for you to stay angry." Ethan looked at the envelope in her hand, then at the children, then back at Naomi, and for the first time in years, the certainty that had always protected him began to feel less like strength and more like cowardice dressed in an expensive suit. Naomi looked at the envelope in her hand for a moment, then lowered it without giving it to him, as if she had already decided that paper alone was too small a thing to carry the weight of 6 lost years. The twins remained at her side, calm in a room that had begun to feel unsteady for everyone else. Ethan could hear the faint clink of glass somewhere near the back of the ballroom, the rustle of silk gowns, the nervous shift of polished shoes over marble, but every sound seemed far away now, as though the night had moved behind a pane of glass and left him trapped inside a silence of his own making. Naomi was the first to step out of it. "I did not come here to ruin your evening," she said, her voice low enough to be controlled and clear enough to cut through the room. "You did that the moment you decided I was someone worth humiliating." Ethan said nothing. He could not deny it. That was the most unbearable part. The cruelty of his invitation had seemed almost elegant in his mind, one sharp private satisfaction hidden beneath formal manners and a guest list. But standing in front of Naomi now, with 2 children beside her and half the city watching, he could feel how small that version of power truly was. Vanessa let go of his arm and folded her hands in front of her, the practiced posture of a woman trying to preserve grace after the floor beneath her has shifted. "You are making accusations in a room full of people," she said. "Surely if you had something real to say, you would have handled it privately." Naomi turned her head slightly, and the look she gave Vanessa was not hostile. It was almost pitying. "Private was never an option for me," she said. "Not after what his family did with my name." That sentence moved through Ethan like cold water. His family. Not rumor. Not misunderstanding. Not bad timing. His family. Naomi's gaze returned to him, and with that single look the ballroom seemed to dissolve into another place entirely, another season, another life. He remembered the final weeks before she disappeared. The whispers that had reached him first through his mother, polished as concern. The conversation with his brother, who claimed he had seen Naomi meeting another man downtown. The photographs that had appeared without warning, grainy and selective, just enough to suggest betrayal without proving anything. He remembered how quickly anger had felt easier than trust. He had confronted Naomi once, and only once, already convinced of her guilt before she had spoken. She had tried to explain, her hands trembling, her face pale with shock and hurt, but he had been colder than he realized a man could be. He had accused. She had gone quiet, and when she left, he had let pride close the door behind her. Now, standing under chandeliers while his carefully curated future trembled around him, Ethan felt a harder truth begin to take shape. He had never really wanted answers back then. He had wanted confirmation of the wound that justified his pride. "You are saying my family lied to me," he said at last, and his voice sounded strained, as if it had to pass through years of certainty to become speech. Naomi did not blink. "I am saying they decided I did not belong in your world," she replied. "And you made it easy for them." The little girl looked up at Naomi, then at Ethan, sensing the gravity, even if not every detail. Naomi rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, and that simple gesture said more than anything else in the room. She had not only survived what happened, she had built something, tender and steady in spite of it. Ethan looked at the twins again, this time not with shock alone, but with a slow, dawning grief. 6 years. 6 birthdays. 6 Christmas mornings. 6 first days of school. 6 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, doctor visits, lost teeth, and laughter he had never heard. The loss arrived all at once, not because he had been denied it, but because he had turned away before the truth could reach him. Naomi lifted the envelope again, her fingers steady against the cream paper. "You kept asking yourself why I vanished," she said. "You never asked who made sure I had to." Vanessa was the first to laugh, and the sound was thin enough to betray her before the words ever did. It was the kind of laugh people used when panic had put on diamonds and was pretending to be class. She tilted her chin, glanced at the guests surrounding them, and offered the room a smile that asked everyone to remain civilized while she tried to put Naomi back in the place she thought she belonged. "This is absurd," she said, her tone smooth but sharpening at the edges. "Anyone can walk into a party with children and a story." A few uneasy smiles flickered in the crowd, not because anyone believed her, but because people with money often reached for disbelief before they reached for truth. Naomi did not react. She did not flinch, defend herself, or try to compete for the room. She simply stood there with the same quiet authority that had unsettled Ethan from the moment she entered, and in that silence Vanessa's polished confidence began to sound loud, brittle, and strangely juvenile. Ethan could feel the temperature of the night changing around him. This was no longer just a personal reckoning. It was becoming public in the worst possible way, not through shouting or scandal, but through the slow collapse of a version of reality he had once insisted on. Naomi shifted her hand lightly over her son's shoulder, grounding him without drawing attention to it. The boy looked up at her for a moment, then back at Ethan with solemn, searching eyes. The girl remained close to Naomi's side, steady as candlelight, though Ethan noticed the small way her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. They had been taught how to enter difficult spaces with grace. That realization struck him with humiliating force. Naomi had raised them not in chaos, not in bitterness, but in discipline, tenderness, and self-respect. Everything in their posture reflected a home built carefully, even if it had been built without him. Vanessa stepped closer again, unwilling to surrender the room. "If there were truly children involved," she said, with that same careful smile, "surely a woman with integrity would not choose a gala to force a conversation." Naomi turned to her at last, and there was no anger in her face, only the kind of stillness that makes arrogance reveal itself more completely than any confrontation ever could. "A woman with integrity does not force a conversation," Naomi said softly. "She finishes one that powerful people tried to bury." The sentence moved through the ballroom with a force no raised voice could have matched. Ethan saw several guests look away, not out of boredom, but because the truth had become uncomfortable enough to feel personal. He knew that sensation. It was already happening inside him. Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, but Naomi continued before she could reclaim the upper hand. "You think I came here because I wanted his attention," she said, her gaze never leaving Vanessa. "I came because he sent for me. He invited me into this room believing I would arrive carrying shame. He simply did not know I was carrying proof." The envelope in Naomi's hand seemed to gather the attention of every person nearby. Vanessa's expression changed, the confidence in it draining just enough to expose fear beneath the surface. Ethan stared at that cream paper as though it were something alive. He had spent years believing that the past was finished because he had declared it finished. But Naomi was standing in front of him with the kind of evidence that did not merely revisit history. It corrected it. "Naomi," he said quietly, and his voice held something it had not carried all night. Not authority, not irritation, uncertainty. Regret had not reached him fully yet, but its shadow had. Naomi looked at him then, and for one brief moment the room disappeared from Ethan's mind. He saw only the woman he once loved, the woman he had failed, and the immeasurable distance between those truths and the life he had built to avoid them. "You do not get to say my name like we are standing in the middle of a misunderstanding," she said. "This did not happen because life got complicated. This happened because I was easy for your world to discard." No one moved. Vanessa, sensing the room tipping further away from her, made one last attempt at control. "And yet you are here now," she said. "Why? To embarrass him?" Naomi's answer came without hesitation. "No," she said. "I am here because embarrassment is temporary. What he needs is clarity." Then she lifted the envelope slightly, not enough to hand it over, just enough to let Ethan understand that whatever came next would not be rumor, emotion, or accusation alone. It would be fact. And for the first time in his adult life, standing in the center of a room built to honor his success, Ethan Crawford felt the distinct and irreversible sensation of being the least powerful person there. Naomi let the silence breathe for one more second before she finally opened the envelope. The sound of paper sliding free seemed louder than it should have been, perhaps because every person in the ballroom understood that whatever happened next would not be softened by charm, money, or social grace. Ethan watched her hands with a focus so intense it almost hurt. He recognized the document stock before he recognized the meaning. A medical letterhead, a laboratory seal, an official signature line. Naomi did not wave the pages dramatically or hold them up for the room like a performance. She only looked at Ethan and said, very calmly, "I never asked you for anything. Not then. Not now. But I will not let you keep living inside a lie that cost my children their father and cost me the right to tell the truth without being called desperate." Vanessa inhaled sharply, as if the sentence itself had crossed some invisible social line. But Naomi did not even glance at her this time. Her attention remained on Ethan, and something in that choice made the air feel thinner. Ethan reached for the papers, but his hand stopped halfway, as though he already understood that once he touched them, there would be no retreat back into uncertainty. Naomi stepped closer and placed the documents into his hand. His fingers tightened around them automatically, the way he might hold a contract worth millions, but this felt nothing like business. The first page was a paternity report dated 6 years earlier. The second was a hospital record from the week Naomi left the city. The third was a copy of a private note from her physician, recommending reduced stress during a high-risk twin pregnancy. Ethan read the words once, then again, the black print refusing to rearrange itself into anything less devastating. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Twin gestation confirmed. Maternal stress concerns documented. He did not hear the whisper that moved through the room, though he saw mouths shift and eyes widen in the edge of his vision. The only thing he truly heard was his own memory, returning not in fragments now, but in brutal sequence. Naomi had come to him that week, pale and shaken, asking if they could talk somewhere private. He had refused. His mother had already filled his head with polished warnings about ambition, image, and women who attached themselves to powerful men. His brother had shown him those selective photographs and insisted Naomi had been seeing someone else. A day later, his attorney had informed him that Naomi had quietly withdrawn from a nonprofit project he funded, and somehow that had seemed like confirmation instead of coincidence. He had built a whole verdict out of fragments that were chosen for him. Ethan turned to the final sheet and felt the floor of the ballroom disappear beneath him. It was a letter, copied and dated, written by Naomi but never delivered. In it, she had explained everything. She had told him she was pregnant. She had begged for 10 minutes to speak in person. She had written that someone from his family had visited her apartment and made it clear she would not be welcome near him, that if she tried to force her way into his life, she would be destroyed publicly and legally. Attached to the copy was proof that the letter had been intercepted by his family office before it ever reached him. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly. The room had gone so quiet it felt sacred and cruel at once. Naomi stood exactly where she had been, poised and unreadable, but there was old pain in her gaze now, not fresh enough to break her, only deep enough to show what surviving had cost. "My mother," Ethan said, though it came out barely above a whisper. Naomi did not nod right away. "Your mother arranged the meeting," she said. Your brother delivered the threat. And you did the rest on your own when you chose not to listen. The truth did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like weight, pressing against every memory until it changed shape. Ethan saw himself again, not as the wounded man he had always imagined, but as someone convenient to manipulate because anger had always been easier for him than tenderness. He looked down at the children then, and for the first time he did not see a resemblance. He saw time, 6 full years of it. Lost birthdays, lost first words, lost mornings, lost ordinary love. The little boy met his gaze without smiling. The little girl leaned closer to Naomi, protective in a way no child should ever have needed to be. Ethan's throat tightened so sharply he had to force the next breath. "Why did you never come back?" he asked, the question sounding smaller than he intended, smaller even than the man asking it. Naomi held his eyes with a steadiness that did not punish him nearly as much as it should have. "Because when a man looks at a woman carrying his children and chooses suspicion over trust," she said, "there is no safe place left for her to return to." For the first time that night, Naomi let the room see that she was tired. Not weak, not shaken, not uncertain, but tired in the way only a woman who has carried too much with grace can be tired. She did not lower her head. She did not tremble. She simply stood beneath the chandeliers with 2 children at her side and years of silence behind her, while Ethan held the papers that had undone the story he had told himself for half a decade. The guests around them had become almost ghost-like now, reduced to breath, fabric, and the occasional hush of discomfort as the truth settled over wealth and reputation with no regard for either. Ethan looked at Naomi as if he had been forced to meet her for the first time, and perhaps in some deeper way he had. He was not seeing the woman his family had described, or the woman his pride had judged, or the memory he had hardened into blame. He was seeing the woman who had survived his absence, protected their children, and entered the most hostile room in the city without surrendering an ounce of her dignity. "Naomi," he said again, but this time her name was not a weapon, not a question, not even a defense. It was an admission of loss. Naomi's expression did not soften. "Do not say my name like regret gives you rights," she said quietly. The sentence landed so cleanly that Ethan felt it more than heard it. Vanessa took a small step backward, and in that movement Ethan understood that even she, for all her pride, knew the night no longer belonged to appearances. Naomi glanced down at the twins, then back at Ethan. "I did not come here because I needed anything from you," she said. "I came because there comes a point when silence stops being grace and starts becoming permission. I would not let my children grow up believing the lie that their mother was disposable or that their father never knew enough to choose better." Ethan's eyes moved to the little boy, then to the little girl. They were watching him carefully now, not with affection, not yet, but with the solemn attention children reserve for moments they know will shape something important even if they do not fully understand what. He realized with painful clarity that Naomi had not raised them to hate him. If she had, this would have looked different. The children would have arrived frightened, angry, or coached into accusation. Instead, they stood with the quiet manners of a home where truth had been protected from cruelty, not sharpened into it. That realization broke something open inside him. "I would have been there," he said, though even to himself the words sounded thin, too late, almost childish in the face of 6 missing years. Naomi held his gaze. "That is what makes this tragic," she replied. "Not that you were incapable of love. It is that you were too proud to recognize it when it stood in front of you asking to be believed." Ethan looked down at the letter again, at the date, at the lines written in Naomi's hand years before this room, this humiliation, this reckoning. He imagined her alone, carrying twins, standing at the edge of a future she had not planned, still trying to give him one honest chance to choose her and their children. And he imagined himself at that same moment, angry in a tailored suit, listening to his mother, trusting convenience, mistaking suspicion for intelligence. The shame of it moved through him with almost physical force. Naomi's voice remained calm, but now it carried the full weight of the lesson he had spent years earning without knowing it. "You thought power meant deciding who mattered," she said. "You thought inviting me here would remind me of what I lost. But Ethan, the brutal truth is this. I did not lose you. I lost an illusion. You are the one who lost a family." No one in the ballroom could look away. Ethan certainly could not. Because every word was true, and truth spoken without cruelty is often the harshest judgment of all. Naomi drew the twins a little closer, not to shield them from him, but to remind him of what had always been real and what could never be recovered in full. I rebuilt my life without your name, without your money, and without your permission, she said. I did not come back to prove that I survived. I came back so you would finally understand what survival cost. And standing there with the evidence in his hand and his entire life exposed for what it had failed to be, Ethan Crawford realized that the most devastating thing Naomi had brought into the room was not the documents, not the children, not even the truth. It was the undeniable fact that she no longer needed him at all. Ethan had never begged for anything in his life. Not in boardrooms, not in courtrooms, not in private negotiations where fortunes changed hands over a single sentence. Men like him were trained early to ask with confidence, to command with ease, and to mistake access for permanence. But standing in the middle of that ballroom with Naomi's words still hanging in the air and 6 years of absence pressing against his ribs, he discovered that regret stripped power down to something almost childlike. "Please," he said, and the words startled even him. Naomi did not react. She simply looked at him with that same unreadable steadiness, one hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder while her son stood close beside her, observant and quiet. Ethan took a step forward, then stopped himself, suddenly aware that movement meant something different now. He was not crossing a room toward a woman he once knew. He was approaching the consequences of everything he had failed to become. "Please let me explain," he said, though the sentence already sounded foolish the moment it left him. Naomi's gaze did not soften. "Explain what?" she asked gently. "That you were deceived, or that you were willing to be deceived as long as it protected your pride?" The question left no safe answer. Around them, the guests remained suspended in a silence that had become almost ceremonial. No one dared interrupt now. Even Vanessa, who had spent most of the night trying to preserve control, stood several feet away with her expression frozen between outrage and humiliation. Ethan could feel her presence like a fading headline, but she no longer belonged to the center of his attention. Nothing did except Naomi, the twins, and the unbearable clarity of the life that might have been. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rawer now, stripped of the polish that had always made him sound composed even when he was not. "I was unforgivably wrong." Naomi watched him for a moment, and Ethan realized that apology, however sincere, was only sound unless it came with the weight of understanding. He had spent years thinking remorse began when a man felt bad. Tonight he was learning that remorse began when a man finally understood the scale of what another person had carried because of him. "Do you know what those years looked like?" Naomi asked. "Do you know what it meant to sit in a doctor's office alone and hear that one heartbeat was now two? Do you know what it meant to sign school forms by myself, to answer questions I could not answer for them, to build a home sturdy enough that your absence would not become their first lesson about love?" Ethan closed his eyes for one brief second, as if darkness might somehow dull the force of her words, but it did not. It only made the images worse. Naomi, pregnant and frightened, sitting alone beneath fluorescent lights. Naomi carrying groceries while balancing 2 toddlers and a future that had given her no room to collapse. Naomi attending parent-teacher nights, birthday dinners, recitals, fevers, and ordinary Tuesday evenings with no one beside her but her own determination. He opened his eyes again and found the twins watching him. There was no accusation in their faces. That was somehow worse. It would have been easier to face anger than innocence. "I want to know them," he said quietly. "I want to do whatever I need to do. I want to make this right." Naomi tilted her head slightly, not mocking him, only measuring the difference between what he wanted and what reality could still offer. "There are some things responsibility can repair," she said. "But do not confuse responsibility with reversal. You cannot make this right by wanting it badly now." Ethan swallowed. Every instinct in him wanted to promise, to fix, to deploy the old machinery of wealth and intention and momentum. He could hire the best family attorneys, the best therapists, the best schools, the best security, the best anything. But looking at Naomi, he knew how insulting that instinct would sound. She had not come for rescue. She had built a life without his resources, and in doing so she had exposed how little his money mattered in the places that counted most. "Then tell me what to do," he said, and for the first time in many years, there was no performance in the question. Naomi glanced down at the twins. Her daughter had leaned into her side, comforted more by Naomi's presence than by anything else in the room. Her son remained still, but Ethan could see intelligence in the boy's eyes, and caution, and a patience no child should have had to develop this young. Naomi looked back at Ethan. "First," she said, "you stop making this about what you feel. Your guilt is not the center of this story. They are." Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if the motion itself cost him something. Naomi continued, her voice steady, elegant, devastating in its restraint. "Second, you understand that access to them is not a prize for regret. It is something you earn through consistency, humility, and time. Not tonight. Not because this room is watching. Not because you suddenly discovered that blood matters when it carries your face." Ethan let the words settle. They were not cruel. That was what made them impossible to resist. They were clear, honest, final in the way truth often is before time has a chance to soften it into memory. "And third," Naomi said, "you accept that whatever role you may have in their future will never erase who I had to become in your absence." Ethan lowered his head then, not from shame alone, but from the dawning realization that redemption was not something he could purchase with one emotional confession under chandeliers. It would be slow if it came at all. It would be tested. It would be measured not by his pain, but by his patience. And as the room stood witness to the unraveling of a man who had once believed time would wait for him, Ethan Crawford understood the coldest part of Naomi's lesson. Love might still leave a door open for responsibility, but time itself never turned back. Naomi let the silence settle one last time, not as a performance, but as a boundary. Then she looked down at the twins, and something in her face changed. The steel was still there, but it softened at the edges into something older and far more powerful than triumph. Love, the kind that had carried her through years of unanswered questions, unpaid emotional debts, and long nights when no one had stood beside her except the two small lives that had given her a reason to keep going. She adjusted the little girl's ribbon, smoothed the shoulder of the boy's jacket, and in those small, ordinary gestures Ethan saw the true architecture of the life he had missed. Not headlines, not gala lights, not family legacy, bedtime stories, packed lunches, school concerts, quiet reassurances after bad dreams. The sacred, invisible work of building children into whole human beings. Naomi had done it all without witness, and suddenly the entire ballroom, with its crystal light and expensive perfume and polished applause, felt like a hollow stage compared to the simple gravity of her hand resting on her children's backs. She lifted her eyes to Ethan again, and there was no hatred in them. That would have been easier for him to bear. What she gave him instead was something far harder. Truth without cruelty. Distance without drama. Mercy without surrender. "I did not bring them here so you would suffer," she said quietly. "Life already handled that for me. I brought them here so the story would end with the truth, not with your version of it." Ethan stood motionless, the documents still in his hand, though by now they felt less like evidence and more like a verdict he had already accepted. Around him, the room remained frozen in reverent discomfort. No one dared step in. No one dared rescue him. The world he had spent years controlling had finally done the one thing power could never prevent. It had made him watch. Naomi glanced once toward the towering windows where the city lights shimmered against the dark, then back to him. "You will hear from my attorney," she said. "Not because I want a war. Because children deserve structure, not promises made under chandeliers." Ethan nodded before he even realized he was doing it. He understood that this, too, was part of her dignity. She would not let emotion turn into chaos. She would not let old love turn into weakness. She would protect the twins the way she always had, with calm, order, and a clarity he had once mistaken for distance. Vanessa said nothing. She had long since become irrelevant to the night, reduced to a figure standing at the edge of someone else's reckoning. The guests, too, seemed diminished now, their wealth and status stripped of meaning by the simple fact that one woman had walked into the room carrying more truth than all of them combined. Naomi offered no final speech, no dramatic flourish, no invitation for sympathy. She did not need any of it. She had already won the only victory that mattered. She had walked back into the place designed to make her feel small and left it standing taller than everyone in it. The little boy looked up at Ethan for a brief moment, as if memorizing him. The little girl leaned into Naomi's side and reached for her mother's hand. Naomi took it instantly, naturally, the way people do when love has become second nature through repetition and sacrifice. Then she turned. The hem of her midnight blue gown moved softly over the marble floor as she guided the twins toward the doors, and the crowd parted for her in complete silence. Not because they were shocked anymore, but because something in them understood that they were watching the real center of the evening leave the room. Ethan did not call after her. For once, instinct did not outrun understanding. He knew that anything he shouted now would only belong to him, and this moment no longer did. It belonged to the woman who had rebuilt her life without bitterness poisoning it. It belonged to the children who walked beside her with grace. It belonged to the truth he should have protected years ago and failed to. He watched Naomi reach the doors, one small hand in each of hers, and for the first time in his life he understood how lonely a man could be in a crowded room. The chandeliers still glowed above him. The orchestra still waited. The city still knew his name. But none of it could follow the woman walking away with what he had once been offered and never deserved to lose. And as the doors opened and Naomi disappeared into the night with the twins at her side, Ethan Crawford remained exactly where she left him, standing in the center of his own success, finally face to face with the one truth no fortune could soften. The strongest person in the room had arrived in silence, spoken with dignity, and walked away with everything that truly mattered.